It was a quiet Sunday morning in Chicago's South Loop. The kind of morning where the city feels half asleep, the streets still damp from the night before. Inside a luxury high-rise, a tenant opened a stairwell door, expecting nothing more than a shortcut to the lobby. But what they saw stopped them cold. Lying in the dim light of the concrete stairwell was a severed human foot. Panic erupted. Police were called, and as officers searched deeper, the gruesome truth unfolded. At the bottom of the stairs was the lifeless body of 36-year-old Caitlin Tracey. The discovery shocked not just the residents of the building, but an entire city. How could a vibrant young woman, with her whole life ahead of her, end up discarded in such a horrifying way? And why was she even there in the first place? Almost immediately, suspicion turned to the person closest to her, her husband. Their marriage was no fairy tale. Behind closed doors were police calls, restraining orders, bruises, and fear, and the high-rise where Caitlin's body was found. It wasn't random. It was his building. Detectives brought him in, questioned him for 2 full days. He had the motive, the opportunity, and a violent past that couldn't be ignored. Yet, just when it seemed justice was about to take shape, he was released. No charges, no answers, and while investigators struggled to piece together what really happened in that stairwell, another, equally dark battle was being waged. Caitlin's body, trapped in the custody of the medical examiner, became the center of a courtroom war. Who had the right to bury her? The husband with the history of abuse, or the grieving parents who just wanted to bring their daughter home to Michigan? What followed was a legal showdown that crossed state lines, pitted judges against each other, and forced Caitlin's family to relive the nightmare again and again. Tonight, we unravel the case of Caitlin Tracey, a woman whose mysterious death left investigators baffled, whose parents had to fight tooth and nail for the right to lay her to rest, and whose story forces us to confront an even deeper tragedy, the silent epidemic of domestic abuse. This isn't just a story about death. It's a story about control, justice, and a mystery that, to this day, has no ending. Before her name became tied to court rulings and headlines, before her photograph was framed by candles at a vigil, Caitlin Tracey was simply Caitlin. Born and raised in the rolling countryside of Michigan, Caitlin grew up in a close-knit Catholic family that valued faith, community, and tradition. She was the middle child, the one her siblings often described as the glue, the person who brought laughter to family dinners, who always checked in with a quick text, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries when everyone else forgot. Friends from high school remembered her as the girl with the infectious laugh and the bright green eyes that seemed to take in everything. She was smart, top of her class, but never arrogant about it. She had a way of lifting people up, even when she herself was struggling. As an adult, Caitlin carried that same warmth into her career and friendships. She had studied hard, built a professional life, and created a circle of people who adored her. Those who knew her best say she had a heart too big for her own good, always giving, always forgiving, often putting others' needs before her own. But behind her kindness was also quiet resilience. Caitlin wasn't naive. She knew life could be cruel. She had seen friends suffer through abusive relationships. She had volunteered at women's shelters, and she believed deeply in the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Ironically, those same instincts, that deep well of empathy, may have played a role in the storm that would eventually consume her own life. Because Caitlin wasn't just a daughter, a friend, or a professional. She was also a wife. Her marriage began like so many others do, with promises of forever, with tender words, with the hopeful dream of building a family together. To the outside world, she looked happy. Social media photos showed smiling vacations, dinners out, milestones shared. But those who looked closer noticed the cracks. Friends described moments where Caitlin seemed quieter than usual, hesitant to share details, almost as if she was protecting someone else's image at the expense of her own truth. Court records, only made public after her death, reveal what her silence tried to hide, a relationship marred by fear. By 2023, Caitlin had filed for an order of protection against her husband. In her own words, she documented at least 4 separate incidents of physical and verbal abuse. She admitted she was afraid for her safety, and yet, even as she tried to fight back, the cycle of intimidation pulled her in deeper. When her husband threatened to sue her for defamation, Caitlin withdrew her petition. It's easy, from the outside, to ask, why didn't she leave? But anyone who has lived through abuse knows that the answer is rarely simple. Love, fear, hope, and control twist together into something that outsiders can easily untangle. Caitlin's friends say she wanted to believe he would change, that beneath the temper and the violence, there was still the man she had once loved. Still, her family remained her anchor. To them, Caitlin was still the daughter who called home often, the sister who laughed over inside jokes, the woman who dreamed of one day raising her own children. They never stopped worrying, but they never stopped hoping. And so when the news came that Caitlin had been found dead in a stairwell hundreds of miles away, the shock wasn't just in the brutality of the discovery. It was in the cruel contrast. How could someone so full of love, so determined to find light in others, meet such a dark and tragic end? Saturday, October 26, 2024, began like any other autumn day in Chicago's South Loop. The weather was cool, the sky gray, the sidewalks bustling with people headed to restaurants and shops. For most residents, it was just another weekend. But for 36-year-old Caitlin Tracey, it would be the last day she was seen alive. That evening, Caitlin seemed to vanish. Her husband, who lived in a luxury high-rise on South Prairie Avenue, told police he hadn't seen her since the night before. He reported her missing, describing her absence as sudden and out of character. But for investigators, his concern raised as many questions as it answered. The following morning, October 27th, a tenant from the building took the stairwell, something few residents ever did, since elevators were the norm. The stairwell was cold, dimly lit, echoing with every step. When the tenant pushed open the heavy door, they froze. There, on the concrete landing, was something that didn't make sense at first, something the mind resists recognizing. A severed human foot. Panic rippled through the building. Police swarmed the stairwell, securing the area. As officers moved down the stairwell, the grim truth became clearer. At the very bottom of the flight of stairs, they found the rest of Caitlin's body. The scene was grotesque, tragic, and bewildering. How had she ended up here, broken and lifeless? Was this a fall, an accident, or something far more sinister? Almost immediately, suspicion turned toward her husband. Not only did he live in the building, but the couple's history was no secret to law enforcement. Police detained him for questioning, holding him for 2 days straight. To investigators, his story seemed thin. He claimed he'd reported her missing out of genuine concern. But the timeline was murky, the details vague. Meanwhile, word of the discovery spread through the building. Neighbors whispered about shouting matches they had overheard between the couple in the past. Others mentioned how Caitlin sometimes looked withdrawn, her smile forced. Forensic teams combed the stairwell, photographing every inch of concrete, bagging evidence, searching for anything that could explain how Caitlin ended up there. But there was no obvious weapon. No camera footage capturing the fatal moment. No witnesses who could place anyone with her in those final hours. As her body was removed from the scene and taken to the Cook County Medical Examiner's office, one question lingered in the minds of everyone who saw her being wheeled out that morning. Was this the tragic end of a troubled relationship, or was there another, darker force at play? What investigators knew for certain was this: a healthy, vibrant 36-year-old woman doesn't simply die in a stairwell without reason. And the answers, whatever they were, would prove harder to uncover than anyone expected. In the days after Caitlin's body was discovered, investigators zeroed in on the most obvious lead, the man closest to her, her husband. He was the one who reported her missing. He was the one who lived in the very building where she was found. And he was the one with a troubling past that painted him as more than just a grieving spouse. Court records quickly came to light. They revealed a marriage scarred by violence. Just 1 year earlier, in October 2023, Caitlin had filed for an order of protection. In her petition, she described at least 4 separate incidents of abuse, some verbal, some physical. Her words were haunting. "I am seeking an emergency order of protection because I am fearful for further abuse." But weeks later, Caitlin withdrew that request. Why? Because, according to court documents, her husband threatened to sue her for defamation and libel. It was a chilling reminder of the power dynamics that often keep victims locked in silence. And this wasn't the only incident on record. Police in New Buffalo, Michigan, where Caitlin and her husband had lived, had arrested him twice earlier in the year for domestic violence. The pattern was clear. Wherever Caitlin went, fear seemed to follow. To detectives, this made him the prime suspect. They held him in custody for 2 full days, pressing him for answers. His alibi was weak. His timeline didn't add up. But the problem was evidence. There were no cameras in the stairwell. No eyewitnesses who had seen him with Caitlin that night. No forensic link tying him directly to her death. Investigators were stuck between suspicion and proof. And as the clock ticked, the law demanded a choice: either charge him or let him go. After 48 hours of questioning, police released Caitlin's husband without filing charges. To Caitlin's family, the release felt like a gut punch. To neighbors, it felt like a mistake. And to the public, it raised a chilling question: if the man with the most motive, the most history of violence, wasn't held responsible, then what really happened in that stairwell? For detectives, this was just the beginning of a maze filled with twists, dead ends, and chilling possibilities. For detectives, the first and most obvious suspect was Caitlin's husband. But when the evidence didn't line up, the case began to drift into murkier waters. With no arrest, the public started to ask the same haunting question investigators were forced to confront: if not him, then who? One theory was simple, almost too simple: accident. The stairwells in high-rise buildings can be dangerous. Poor lighting, concrete steps, and the echo of emptiness create an airy space where a single misstep could mean tragedy. Could Caitlin have slipped, fallen, and suffered catastrophic injuries? On paper, it was possible, but detectives had trouble reconciling that theory with the gruesome reality of how her body was found, not just injured, but dismembered. A severed foot was not the usual result of a tumble down the stairs. Another theory pointed to suicide. Had Caitlin, under the weight of a troubled marriage and years of abuse, chosen to end her life? But those who knew her best rejected the idea immediately. Her parents insisted she had plans for the future. Friends remembered her determination to leave her toxic marriage behind. And Caitlin herself had sought protection, had tried to take steps toward safety. Suicide didn't fit the woman they knew. Still, the possibility lingered, and the lack of answers gave it oxygen. Then there were whispers of something even darker. What if someone else in the building was involved? High-rise apartments are home to hundreds of people, strangers living behind thin walls and locked doors. Could Caitlin have crossed paths with the wrong person at the wrong time? Could her death have been the result of a random encounter, an act of violence unrelated to her marriage? Detectives considered it. They canvassed the building, interviewed tenants, searched for anyone with a history of violence or unusual behavior. But no solid lead emerged. And yet the strangest detail of all refused to fade. The discovery of Caitlin's body didn't begin with her body at all. It began with her severed foot, a single piece of her life, left on a stairwell landing like a grotesque clue. What exactly had happened in those final moments between her disappearance and her death? Every explanation seemed incomplete. Every theory ended in contradictions. And while investigators searched for answers, Caitlin's family was about to face a battle of their own, not over how she died, but over who had the right to decide what happened to her after death. While detectives sifted through conflicting theories, another battle was brewing, one that had nothing to do with stairwells, evidence bags, or alibis. It was a fight for Caitlin herself. Because as her body lay in the custody of the Cook County medical examiner, her husband and her parents went to war over one question: who had the right to bury her? On one side was her estranged husband. He insisted that as her spouse, the law gave him authority. His plan was chilling to Caitlin's family. He wanted her cremated, the ashes kept in his possession. To her parents, this felt like the ultimate act of control. Even in death, Caitlin would never escape him. On the other side were Caitlin's grieving parents. They argued their daughter had been the victim of a long history of physical and emotional abuse. They believed, with absolute certainty, that Caitlin would never have wanted her husband to decide her final resting place. Instead, they wished to bring her back home to Michigan, to give her the Catholic funeral and burial that reflected her faith and their family's tradition. The fight wasn't just emotional, it was legal. Attorneys filed motions into different states. In Berrien County, Michigan, Judge Brian Berger listened as the parents' lawyers detailed the disturbing history. Multiple arrests, restraining orders, threats, and police reports documenting Caitlin's fear of her husband. For the judge, the pattern was impossible to ignore. He ruled in favor of Caitlin's parents, granting them authority over her remains. But in Chicago, the battle wasn't over. A restraining order still tied Caitlin's body to Cook County, preventing her release. So the case moved into the hands of Judge Eve Riley. In a tense hearing, the family's attorney described the urgency, the heartbreak, the cruelty of forcing parents to fight for the right to bury their child. Finally, on November 15, 2024, Judge Riley lifted the restraining order. After weeks of delay, after motions and counter-motions, after unbearable limbo, Caitlin's parents could finally take their daughter home. For the first time since her death, there was movement toward closure. Not justice, not yet, but a step, a chance for Caitlin to be honored, not controlled. But the courtroom victory was bittersweet, because while her family prepared her funeral, the questions of how Caitlin died and who was responsible remained as unanswered as ever. The courtroom decisions in Michigan and Illinois opened the door. After weeks of anguish, Caitlin's parents were finally free to do the one thing every grieving parent longs for: lay their daughter to rest. In mid-November, Caitlin's body was released from the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. Her parents drove her back to Michigan, across the same highways they had traveled countless times during happier years, only now, their daughter was in a casket, not in the passenger seat. The funeral was held in a small Catholic church, surrounded by stained glass and flickering candles. Family, friends, and members of the community filled the pews, clutching tissues and rosaries. The air was heavy, the silence broken only by soft hymns and muffled sobs. At the front of the church, Caitlin's parents sat side by side, hands clasped tightly together. Their attorney had called the legal rulings a significant step, but to them, it was more than that. It was the final act of love they could give their daughter, to free her from a man who had hurt her in life, and who tried to control her even in death. As the coffin was carried down the aisle, rays of light from the stained glass painted the wood in shades of blue and gold. Outside, the November wind rustled through bare trees as the family gathered at the cemetery. There, in the quiet Michigan soil, Caitlin was finally laid to rest. But the moment, as sacred as it was, carried with it a haunting shadow. Because while her parents had won the right to bury her, the deeper questions remained unanswered. Who had taken Caitlin's life? Was it the husband she feared? Was it an accident in a stairwell? Or was there a truth no one had yet uncovered? The burial was not the end. It was, in many ways, the cruelest reminder that justice had not been served, that closure was only partial, that the case remained open, and that Caitlin's voice had been silenced before it could tell its own story. For her family, the fight in the courtroom was over. But for investigators, the battle to solve the mystery of Caitlin Tracey's death was only beginning. With Caitlin finally laid to rest, her parents could begin mourning the daughter they lost. But grief is complicated when it's tied to unanswered questions, because while the legal battle had ended, the investigation into Caitlin's death was still wide open. The Cook County Medical Examiner had not yet determined an official cause of death. Toxicology reports, autopsy findings, and forensic reviews were still pending. Every delay stretched the family's suffering, leaving them caught in a painful limbo. Meanwhile, the husband, the man Caitlin once trusted, the man she had feared, the man whose history of violence was written into court records, walked free. No charges, no trial, no accountability. He was a shadow lingering over the case, a reminder of the justice that never came. For Caitlin's parents, the courtroom victories were a step toward peace, but they were not justice. They were not truth. In their public statements, the family chose to remember Caitlin for who she was, a remarkable woman taken too soon. They expressed gratitude for the support they received, and hoped that her story might shine a light on the often hidden tragedies of domestic abuse. And yet, the mystery remains. How did Caitlin Tracey really die? Was her life stolen in an act of violence that has yet to be proven? Or was her death the result of a tragic accident, forever tangled in suspicion? As of today, those questions linger unanswered. Caitlin's voice has been silenced, but her story continues to echo, in the courtroom, in the investigation, and in the hearts of those still searching for truth. Sometimes, in true crime, the scariest ending isn't a solved case. It's the one where the mystery remains. If Caitlin's story moved you, help us keep her memory alive. Don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe for more true crime stories that need to be told.